Am I saying your last name right? Luz? Okay.
It's a mouthful, but.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start. I apologize for starting late this morning. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Yolanda Williams. I work in customer service here at the National Archives. And I'd like to welcome you to our Know Your Records lecture today. We're so pleased to have you here, that you have interest in one of our presentations. For those of you who do not know, the Know Your Record program informs our staff, our volunteers, our researchers, and the general public on the records that we have here at the National Archives and how they aid in historical research. We offer these weekly, as well as we have the monthly genealogy programs, online videos, and our annual genealogy fair, and also a researcher newsletter. There's also a copy on the table. If you have not gotten one, feel free to take one for yourself. It's the newer version of the researcher newsletter. Please take a moment after the presentation is over today to please do the evaluation. That helps us to know how much you enjoyed the program today. And if you have suggestions for future programs, please write that on your evaluation. And I'll be back to collect those before you leave, okay? I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, Ms. Pam Luce Noji. And she'll be talking about the Real Widows of the Pension Office. Today's session will be about an hour. And there's a bit of information about her in the folded handout. I won't take time to read that. You can read that at your leisure. She usually talks about, she's going to discuss the details today about the usual contents of a widow's pension file, and she'll share the amazing stories that she has found while volunteering here at the National Archives. I'd like to introduce to you today our speaker, Ms. Pam Luce Noji. Thank you.
Good morning. I guess it's still morning. Yes, I got involved in this because I worked on the digitization project for the widow's pension. So I got a chance to see way more than you would if you were just going to go see a couple of your own relatives. The widow's pension digitization project is ongoing, and unfortunately I'm no longer working with them, but they have, and I don't know the exact numbers that they're at. They started by number sequence, by certificate number sequence. So they started at 0, if there was such a one, or 1. I believe they're up to the 120,000, maybe even 130,000 in terms of what they've prepped for digitization, because they prepped them in a certain way. And they may well be already digitized. The problem is they didn't all get online yet. So if you get a widow's certificate number, the last number, and I'll show you where that is on the cards, that's under, let's just say 50,000, it should be online. If it's over that, you're still stuck with the paper records until they start really getting them online, in addition to obviously having to prep more. There are approximately 1.2 million widows' pensions files. And there was a time when they thought this project would take 100 years. They've kind of gotten it down to about 50. And, with new technologies, maybe that'll speed up. And this is a small segment of all of the Civil War pension files that exist for the soldiers, what we call the invalid files. But at any rate, we're going to talk about the widows' pensions, which in fact include widows, mothers, fathers, and minors. They kind of all got lumped together. So anything that isn't simply an invalid pension for the soldier himself. But what really got me involved in this is the concept of story. And this was my first lovely lady. Now, this is not her actual photograph, but it's an image of a 19th century woman, and that is an image of the part of Boston that I believe she lived in at the time of the events in the story. It's a she said, she said story. Dear Flora Bartlett decided that she was rather ticked off with a friend of Henrietta's. And the way to get back at Henrietta was to bring charges against Henrietta and try to get Henrietta's pension revoked. There had been a law in 1882 that talked about anti-cohabitation. This was a moral clause, as it were. But it was also practical in the sense that they were trying to get off the pension rolls women who had not remarried technically, i.e. not with the church or with civil authorities, but were living with men as if they were their husbands, because you were supposed to lose your pension if you remarried because you had some means of support, your man. So they were trying to get rid of these women who were not quite so moral as to know they needed actual marriage and then got kicked off the pension rolls. So it was sort of for moral issues that Flora decided to bring charges against Henrietta. She said that Henrietta ran a bawdy house. Henrietta cohabited with a man who sometimes paid some of her bills, and she had had an illegitimate child after the death of her soldier husband. Well, unfortunately, the illegitimate child bit is true. She definitely did have that. And she and her son stayed together for years. But she tried to bring forth, with lots of people testifying for her, that she hadn't been in a bawdy house, and if bad things had been going on in the house where she was the housekeeper, she didn't know, and all this sort of thing. Unfortunately, Flora was in ascendance, and she lost her pension. Henrietta lost her pension, and never got it back, even after she tried a second time, when she brought forth one of the affiants, one of the people who gave an affidavit from the earlier trial or examination, who said, oh, I'm recanting my story. I was forced by Flora to say bad things about Henrietta. Well, the pension office still wasn't too keen, so they never gave her back her pension. So obviously Flora thinks that she's victorious at this point, but she gets a comeuppance herself, and then if living well is revenge, Henrietta gets her revenge as well. So what happens a few years later is that Flora, who has a Navy widow's pension, has her husband come back after 30 years out of the blue and says, hey, she never divorced me. I'm still alive. What the heck's she getting a pension for? And he goes down to the pension office and says, this is a damn swindle on the government. Don't give her any more money. So she loses her pension. And of course, she doesn't really end up cohabiting with him because they don't like each other by then. But then Henrietta, well, what's she going to do? Henrietta was a survivor, and this is probably why I loved Henrietta. And she may have been slightly naughty, and she may have actually even run a bawdy house for all I know, but she survived. So what we have here is the, okay, let me just see where I do. Right here, this is the 1870 census. This is after she's widowed. She's here, she has 2 little children, and she's living with her in-laws in Maine. Well, this was kind of boring, so of course she ended up going to the big city and kind of having these problems, but you notice she's a milliner. And early on in Boston, she's a milliner and a dressmaker. So after the pension is revoked, she goes back to her dressmaking. She sort of survives. She sends her son to school. Everything's going on okay. And then she decides to get even more cool. She becomes an electric physician. Whole new profession. Now, I don't know if you know what an electric physician is. I certainly did not, so I had to kind of Google and do some stuff. But it seems that at this time, there was a notion that the electricity from batteries could cure certain diseases. And there was a woman who popularized this idea, and she did lecture in Boston just about this time. Now, I can't say for sure that Henrietta heard her, but she got involved in this, and I might think she got a slightly better remuneration for electric physician than she did as a dressmaker. And then I would say that Henrietta's final triumph is that she continued to live. Her son prospered. Her son finished his education, got a job, got a house in the suburbs, took Henrietta out of the city with him to the house in the suburbs. She unfortunately died in 1906. He married in 1908 and lived happily ever after. So her son got the American dream anyway. So that's Henrietta's revenge. So this is the story that got me so interested in looking into files for more than just ordering the documents the way we were supposed to and moving on to the next file. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. Terribly sorry. So let's get a little history. This is the pension office. You probably know the building downtown. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous building. Kind of an awful lot of space empty here, though, but just think of all these old-fashioned 19th century clerks running around doing their thing in here. The building was opened in 1884. There's 2 funky legends about the building. One is that women were not allowed on the 3rd floor. Why? Nobody seems to be able to tell me. And you would be fined if you threw orange peels off the 4th floor. What that has to do with the price of tea in China, I don't know. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. So this is the boring part, but it's important history. Pension laws. You sort of need to have this as a background to understand what you're seeing in different pensions and in different affidavits at different times to know why perhaps somebody has to go and have a special examination based on the laws. So the first pension law was in 1789 for the gentleman in the Revolutionary War, and by the time 1861 rolls around, 11,284 names are on the rolls, and it's costing the U.S. government already $1 million per year. But they're about to get inundated. So the Civil War comes along, and then widows of people killed in action got arrears of pay and $100. But they finally realized that wasn't really going to help because they needed something for, especially guys who would come home sick and die at home. So you died sort of because of the war, but you didn't die on the battlefield. So this is the big general law. It's a soldier has to have a disease or disability related to service, and then the widow could get the pension after he got the pension, or of course if he was killed, she would get the pension. She lost her pension if she remarried. She could reapply if re-widowed, although for a while only if she was re-widowed once. You couldn't have like lots of husbands until later on, then they kind of opened that up and they didn't care how many husbands you'd had. And then this is the mother's pension was allowed at this point. And things change over time. The 1864 law was interesting because it changed the requirements for proving marriage, particularly for men who served who were ex-slaves who didn't have access to the same kinds of documentation that others would have. And on we change. Here's my anti-cohabitation law of 1882. And then, whoa, by 1940, a whopping $40 a month is your pension allowance. Now, I don't know, that might not be that bad for 1940. I'm not sure. Oh, come on, Lucas. So now we have to get the documents. So that's what I'm going to try to divide this up into: getting the documents, what you're going to find in the documents, and then I'm going to tell you some of my really fun stories. Not that Henrietta wasn't fun already. So you've got to find out whether your gentleman has a pension or not. There are two ways to find online. There's the one at Fold3 and the one at Ancestry. They come from different microfilmed sets of records, so they will have some differences. There's some overlap, but not all. And I've been told that there's about 20% of the names on those microfilms that never made it online. So if you don't find your person, you will, oh, shoot. Come on. You will want to go to the actual microfilms down at Archives 1. They're done in alpha order, so you can look for your gentleman there. Now, you'll find the name this is the Ancestry version. You will find the dependent. You will not find that on the version over here. You need to take down all of this information to fill out your poll slip. You need the unit, the Company C of Unit 53, Pennsylvania Artillery, blah, blah, blah. And you need every single one of these numbers in exactly the right kind of place. The application number, the certificate number. You want to keep all that information clear. And then here is just a note of information down here. If you get a file with an XC number on it, you need to write that down, but you might be having a problem if you have an XC file because many of them are not at the archives yet. They're still in the custody of the Veterans Administration. So you have to get them by a FOIA request. And let's say I never got one, so hope to goodness that you don't have an XC file so that they will be there at the archives. You can fill out your poll slip to get them. And so this is what the poll slip actually looks like. And you can see how the numbers fit exactly in the application, the certificate. It should be on the widow's line, on the minor line. You just got to do that all right. And you get your name and your research card number and so forth. And you put these in down at A1, and you get your pension in about an hour. Now, this is for the prepared files, because this is what we were doing for the digitization. There were a particular set of documents that we pulled up front and put in an exact order. So if you're looking at either the online files or a paper file that has been prepped, which I've seen some of them when I've gone back to look at stuff, they still have the paper prepped files. They will be in this order. The other ones, boy, it's all bets are off. Everything is in any kind of order. But we pulled first the brief. This is the front sheet that kind of gives a synopsis of everything. You've got the woman, darn it. You've got the name of the person applying, the name of the soldier. You've got his service, the death, the marriage, and whether there are any children. So this just gives you a quick synopsis of what you might find in the file for this particular gentleman. Then the next thing you see is the application. This is a very nice application because it's a printed form. They are not all printed forms. Some of them are simply a handwritten court document that looks like any other affidavit, but it says, you know, I'm applying for the pension under the act of blah, 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 blah. So you have to, you can't think that just because it doesn't look like this, that it isn't the application itself. And you find some interesting things on the application. You find the name of the person who's coming in front of the court saying, I want the pension. You get the name of the gentleman who served. You get where he died. Usually a quick marriage record or notion of when they married, but here you don't quite get the maiden name yet. So you're still, if you're a genealogist, you're still holding out for maiden names if you want to research that. And then down here, she's given information about the children. And interestingly enough, in this one, she hello? Well, I guess, she actually says where the information comes from. It comes from a family Bible. And you will get, if the person can write, their actual signature, or you will find out that they signed with a mark. The back of the page is interesting because they're affidavits of people who say, yeah, this is the lady who she says she is, and she really is the widow of so-and-so, and blah, blah, blah. But as a family researcher, you want to at least note down the names because these are likely family members, and it may help you later on in your research. Then you get the AGO form. That's the Adjutant General's form. That's specifically the document from the government that says what his service was. So you've got the regiment he signed up for, when he signed up for, and occasionally you'll have some information about the death of the soldier, although that's not always on the AGO form. But you get regiment, company, date and place of enlistment. Then you have the SGO form, which is the Surgeon General's office, and this is the medical form. This is the one that should tell you how he died. And note here, this lovely gentleman died in General Hospital in Danville, Virginia, of chronic diarrhea. Remember, most people in this war died of disease, not of being shot on the battlefield. I can't tell you how many times it's diarrhea, smallpox, or typhoid that's the cause of death. The interesting thing is you can also find sometimes some extra documentation, and this one's fun because it doesn't just tell you that he died or that he died from complications to amputation of his leg. That's what's up here, but down here you get the story. He was unable to be moved off the battlefield, and he was left there until the morning of da-da-da-da-da. And then he was taken off to the hospital, and then we amputated his leg, and then he died. So you get something more than just the bare facts, and that's what really, to me, brings a lot of this information alive. Then, of course, the thing that we're interested in are the family records, the vital records that we can do genealogy. That's basically what I'm interested in, although there are many other things to be interested in these files. This is a plain old regular marriage record. It's a civil marriage record. But it can be a church record, a civil record, and as I said, sometimes it got sort of opened up that affidavits would work when there were no actual records available. So then we get her maiden name. Oh, actually, I think, no, I guess that isn't. But this is actually the same one that the application was just a minute ago. And here, because that was Jackson Messenger, and now we've got her maiden name. So that begins to help us out in our family history. Then you also have to show the births of children when we get past the pension law that adds $2 a month for every child under the age of 14. So you have to prove you have the children, you have to prove their ages. So in this case, we have a nice thing that's actually from a church record, baptism. Really, there wasn't a whole lot of civil records of births at this time. So you're going to have mostly the church records, or in this case, an affidavit. And you can see that the lovely lady says, I was present at the birth of, and she lists all of the kids that and gives some nice little dates. Now you find sometimes discrepancies if you have more than one affidavit, but they're close. The ones that are fun are the ones that say, well, he was born in that spring when we had the really big snowstorm, and it was just about a month after I had my Johnny, and Johnny's 16, so, so you really get kind of, again, more of a window onto the lives of these people than just simple facts. And then you've got the sad ending to the file, the drop card. The pensioner has to die at some point. So for the most part, we have these purple or red cards that have the name of the pensioner, the name of the person whose service was the reason for the pension. We've got the last payment sent, and we've got the date of death. Interestingly enough here, the death is reported by a postmaster. So that kind of makes you think the poor woman is living alone because there's no family member to tell what's going on, but just the fact that her mail is no longer deliverable because she has passed away. Occasionally you'll find something a little bit more personal like this, which is somebody sending in their own note saying, my mother, Mrs. Blah Blah, died, and she had this pension certificate number and whatever. Of course, you could be fraudulent and try to keep the pension after somebody died, but there was something of a benefit to showing that somebody had died because you got a little bit of money for care for the person at the end if they were ill and for funeral expenses. So it was kind of iffy as to whether you wanted to be fraudulent and hold on or not.
Were these kind of like government checks that came in the mail, or how did you get paid?
Had changed over time, really big time. You used to have your pension certificate and go to a certain location to get your payment from somebody who was authorized to give it, and you only got it quarterly. You did not get these things monthly. By the time you get into the 20s and so forth, the banking system is a little bit different, and you did get these little chits, which I've seen in some files, and you had to take the chit somewhere, but you did start to be able to go monthly rather than quarterly. So it definitely did change over time. And then what we have at the end of the prepped files to show you kind of that you're at the end of the special stuff up front are these what we call wrappers. You have to remember that all of these documents were originally stored in the trifold manner, which was the typical way of storing stuff in the 19th century for everything. I've done some original court record searching. They're trifolded. You take an 11 by 8, trifold, and you stick it in a wrapper, and you stick it in a box, and you smunch them in. And that's why sometimes when we try to open these things, they break at those seam areas or at those bend areas and everything. But that's how they were originally stored, were in these wrappers. What's sometimes fun is on the back of these wrappers, there's a handwritten list of all the activity that had happened to this file over time. And for me, it was really fun once. I was trying to find a guy in my family who I thought was in the Civil War, and I got the thing with what seemed to be the right name on it. And on the back, it showed in 1922 that a relative of mine had also looked at that pension file. And then I was looking at it, and guess what? We were both wrong. That wasn't our guy. It was a different guy. But we at least both did the same research first through the wrong guy before we got to the right one. And then there's all the rest. That's just an image of one of the open files. They can be fat, they can be thin, they can be clipped together here with these kind of clippers or loose papers. Sky's the limit. It can be anything. So here are some of the other things you can find in a file. And I can't even absolutely say that all of the documents I've just said are in every file. They are the typical documents that kind of should be in every file, but even they're not. And then what I'm going to show you now is not necessarily in every file, but could be. Letters from the front. Let me tell you, the women I worked with on my shift, we definitely did cry together a couple of times. Some of these are very, very sad. But they do give you a sense of what's going on for the soldier. So this is the typical kind of, I've been very sick and I'm getting worse. See, getting. And take best care of yourself and the children. And then the guy did die. And so we've got this in a widow's pension. The reason that we have them rather than the original recipients of the letters having them are that they're sent in as proof of relationship, of need, of a variety of different things. But it's sad that the family didn't get to keep these things. This one is a really fun letter from the front. This is a young guy, and he's describing an incident where in their tent, somebody was messing around, the gun went off, the shot went through somebody's leg and then through somebody's pants, and then it liked to hit me on the face, and I felt the wind of it as it went by. And you get this like moment-to-moment idea of what was going on in his little camp life. And then this guy was a writer. I mean, he went on and on. But then he starts another story down here. if you see, it says, and then so one day we found a hearse on the road. And then he goes on to tell the story that they thought there was something a little odd. They stopped the hearse, and lo and behold, there were enemy guns in the coffin, not a person, and they, confiscated the... Anyway, you can sometimes get this great feeling of what's going on for these guys, which just really makes these people, real people with real things going on for them. Then for letters to mom, and this made many of the women who were mothers really upset that the mothers had to relinquish these letters, these last tangible items of their sons, to the pension office. But mostly in this case, they were trying to show dependence. They needed to show that they depended on these soldiers' sons for their sustenance in order to get a pension. So most of these, or the one that I'm going to show you now, is about money. Here, I had sent $15 in it, and here I've got $26.50 in my pocket, but I won't send it until I hear whether, and notice the lovely spelling of whether, you got the last package. So they're continuously sending money home to mom, and this is important for them to show the pension office so they can get their pension. Actually, one of the other funny ones was when the guy says, "Gee, Ma, thanks for the cake. It was smunched, but we ate it anyway." So it's amazing the kind of back and forth with correspondence going on with the front, but then, I don't know, they probably weren't at the front all that often. They were in camps and so forth. And so there seemed to be some ability to get mail around, and there were express companies, which I assume are not the US mail, but that were used as a way to move products and money back and forth. So that's kind of fun. And then, of course, the other sad ones, condolences to the widow. But it is nice when the commanding officer takes time to write the letter, rather than simply getting, I don't know, whether they got telegrams or whether they had the two men come up to the front door like they do now. I'm not quite sure how they were notified of the death of their soldier. But in this case, oh, shoot, darn it. So he is writing to her, "Dear so-and-so, I'm so sorry to tell you that your husband died. He was only sick a few days," which is a nice thing. "It was brought on by excessive fatigue during our late fighting with the enemy." He tells her that he's been buried, and he's been buried with a headboard that is properly marked, so you can find the grave if you ever want to go and pick up the body. And then he talks about how he was the most faithful and soldier-like member of his team, and gives you sort of a nice pep talk. And then I'm hoping that he is in a better place, kind of a thing, and then yours truly, the commanding officer. So those are fun. Sometimes that will give you more information about the circumstances of the decease of the person, if it's not already in the SGO form or something like that. So fun, but not fun, if you know what I mean. It's interesting, but it's not funny. I loved this one. This is a son sending this home to mom and dad. This is an engraving from a newspaper of the battle that he was in. He wanted to show everybody what's going on. And he did it by marking us and them with X's and O's, which you can see there's some X's on those tent. There are some O's over there. Actually, these gentlemen down here have little O's by them. And then in his letter, he goes on to describe his role in the battle in the context of what she can see in this image. Now, nowadays, I don't know, maybe a censor would not have let this information about what was going on the front come directly to the populace, as it were. But I thought this was just hilarious. And it's right there in the file and beautifully preserved. Then we get other kinds of family records. There are fewer Bibles than I'm aware of in these pensions than there were in the Revolutionary War pensions, it seems to me. But if you needed to prove mom, dad, and the kids, you might do something and send in this really quite lovely German family. It's not exactly an Ahnentafel, but something of that nature. And again, the notion is, remember, they didn't have copy machines. They couldn't send in a copy unless they got a certified person to say, yes, this is what I've copied from the Bible, but they sent in their actual records, which then they no longer owned, but the archives does. Then there's the sense of other marriages. Okay, we talked about the marriage of the soldier and the widower. Sometimes either of those parties had been married before, And many times, the spouse married again afterwards. But remember, every time a woman marries, she changes her last name, and they're hard to trace if you don't know what's going on. So in this case, what we have is we have the soldier and his spouse, who is now the widow, who's asking for the pension, doing their thing in Randolph County, Indiana. But then we get a lovely piece of additional information. There is Mary Ann Bales now marrying again Mr. Jacob Castor. This was actually a disaster that she did this, but he was something that kind of rhymes with Castor. But then it also shows that she's gone out to Decatur County, Iowa. So you've got a change of place, a change of name, and you can help follow people along further in ways that you might not have done otherwise. Then you have divorce. Yes, there was divorce at this time. Actually, there was divorce way before this, but divorce was even more common than I thought at the time. And bizarrely enough, it was kind of good to have a divorce record, because if you were, in fact, separated, estranged, whatever, from hubby, you wanted something to prove that so that you could prove that you did not have dependence on a man who could sustain you. You needed to show that you were a single woman, so that you needed to either get your pension or get your pension back, depending on the situation. This gives you an idea of time. I just underlined this date. So there's definitely divorces going on, 1872. But the thing I loved about this one is this line that one of my colleagues read out to us when she first found it, because she thought it was just so hilarious. But this is a guy saying, I heard the man in the case say his wife was a damned good woman, but that he didn't care a damn for her, and he wasn't going to live with her. And this was after a whole bunch of affidavits that actually showed he was quite a naughty boy and brought home other ladies into the household, acting as if they were his wife while the wife was still there, and really, really not nice things. And she was very, very upset. But she had her divorce record, and she could re-get her pension, which she had lost upon marrying him after she had been widowed by her soldier. This one's also cute. You needed to show you had, what's the word? You had rights over the children that you wanted to use for your $2 a month extra for your kids. So, of course, you had to show that they were born. But remember, legally, women did not have legal custody of their children just because their husbands died. They didn't. They actually had to go to the court to petition for guardianship to be able to have legal rights over the children, to contract legal type events. So women had to go and get guardianship. So this woman, our lovely lady, whose name I probably don't, let's see, she's Matilda. So Matilda remarries, but she doesn't necessarily have her second husband have the guardianship. She has guardianship. She loses her pension, but she keeps the pension for the kids over whom she has guardianship. But then all of a sudden, I saw a second set of guardianship papers in this file. Guardianship for this gentleman, who is in fact her second husband. I'm like, okay, she got guardianship. Now, why is he getting guardianship too, or after? Well, it turns out it is after. And the reason is for this: to fill a vacancy occasioned by the insanity of Matilda, who was the previous guardian. So she gets widowed, she gets guardianship of her kids, she gets remarried, and then she goes nuts, and second hubby gets guardianship of the kids. Now, they still got their pension until they were 16, but you don't necessarily always think you're going to find guardianship papers in these files, but you do.
You said 14 once. Is it 14 or 16?
Sorry, it's 16.
16?
16, sorry if I screwed that up. Now, not all widows had husbands who died on the battlefield or who died in hospital during the war. Sometimes men would come home and then die rather quickly. They would come home very sick. Or they could die, in 1916 and then still leave a widow who wanted a pension. But one of the things that you can find in the files are these discharge papers, which kind of repeat some of the stuff you already know now, but when he signed up, where he signed up, what he served in, but it also shows where he was discharged. So in case he was discharged a long way from where you think he lived, you might want to think about how he got home. And sometimes they had a long ways to go from where they got discharged to get home. Then the holy grail is finding a picture. Tintypes, that's pretty much all that we see are tintypes, but this is an image of the actual soldier. They would send these home to mom, sweetheart, wife, whomever, having their picture taken in uniform, and once again, the family would send it in as some sort of proof that they were related, that they had a soldier husband, a soldier son, whatever, and they no longer have the photograph, but we do. And boy, when we find these, we go nuts. And I can't even remember whether I actually found this one. I think I might have, but I found a few during the 1 year that I was working, and it's just amazing. Then you get health forms. I told you that the widows' pensions kind of have widows, mothers, fathers, minors, but if a soldier had a pension first, then he died after having had the pension, and the widow gets sort of like a pension after or on top of that, they consolidated the files. So you will find information about the soldier's pension if such a consolidated file is going on. And sometimes it's extremely confusing when a woman who'd been widowed once marries another soldier, he dies, and she gets the pension. And sometimes it's better to get the pension from the first husband than from the second husband. And you've got files all over the place, and you have really quite a time to organize the stuff, to get the stuff for this guy, the stuff for this guy, the stuff for the widow. It's quite fun.
Did most of these people use a lawyer, or they just did it themselves? Or you don't know?
I don't know what the percentage is. There definitely were lawyers who did this. There were people who were given power of attorney to do this. But a lot of times it was people going in front of their county court, saying, I am in front of Joe Schmo, honorable judge, blah, 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 blah. And at that point, I think they knew the verbiage pretty well about what you kind of had to say. So I don't know completely what lawyers got involved, but there were some. There were definitely some. And there were medical boards who filled out these papers for the soldiers, because during most of the time, they had to show some disability, and early on, they had to show that the disability was connected to their service. So there was, somebody just told me this yesterday, it started out that there was 1 doctor per county, and later on they had 3 doctors per county who were allowed to do these forms and fill them out. And if you've got a pensioner who gets really old, and I've seen some of these, there's a ton of these forms in the file, because they not only had to re-file these pieces of information every time the pension law changed and you got like a little bit more money or something, they also had to recertify like every 2 to 3 years, even if the law doesn't change. So you get tons and tons of these documents, and sometimes they get pretty boring, but on the other hand, they give you all the kinds of things like, here's his temperature and his heart rate and all this stuff, and then they talk about what kind of diseases he has. And sometimes you can see him getting sicker and sicker and sicker over time. And you had to qualify in a certain sense for a percentage of disability. It wasn't just full disability just because you had a leg wound. You might have a 1/4 disability or a 3/4 disability, and you got a different amount of money for each of these things. I absolutely love these little pictures. I mean, I just think they're hilariously funny. I personally have never seen one with any marks on it, but I talked to somebody on Tuesday who had seen actually a mark that showed, okay, the bullet went in by the knee and came down and went out here. And so at least ostensibly, they could be used as a way to show what kind of problems there were with this guy's health. Then, if you weren't happy with the regular pension and the acts and how much money you got and whether the pension office gave you a pension or didn't give you a pension, you did have one more recourse: your congressman or your senator. So you could apply for a special act. If normal channels don't work, you go around the houses. So this is what this lovely lady did. Now, Cora is the daughter of somebody who was killed in the war. And much, much later, she comes back and says, and this is very likely due to a change in the law that said permanently disabled minors of soldiers could get a pension for life. And I believe that's where she was trying to go. The pension office wasn't really giving in to her story, but she was persistent. Let me tell you, there were letters and letters and letters like this, handwritten, cramped, both sides of the page, sometimes 7, 10 pages long. And I'm not talking about one, I'm talking about a lot. She keeps saying, I need my pension, I need my pension. Look at here, please answer quickly, I am in a great hurry. Okay, she gets her special act. This is from, I believe it's the Congressional Record where these get put in. Yes, you know, he tells the story of this woman, and this woman really was nutso. She was in a facility for about 6 years. She was now out, but she's physically ill. She's still sort of nutso, which you could tell from these letters, to be perfectly honest. So they finally decide to give her the pension. She gets the pension about 3 months after she dies. So, after. Yeah. And then I don't know if everybody knows what USCT stands for. It stands for US Colored Troops. And I'm not being politically incorrect. This is what they were called. So it's not just the Massachusetts 54th that was made famous in the movie Glory. Many states had colored units, more than one. Massachusetts ended up having more than one. And at some point, and I don't think that's necessary for every unit, but a certain number of units got folded into the US colored troops and were federalized. So they were no longer state troops, they were federal troops. Now, in a US colored troop pension file, you will find basically all the same kinds of things you would find in any pension file. But then sometimes you can find a few things that are a little bit more interesting. And I never expected to find this, but this is a manumission document. And this shows that Henrietta, Breckinridge. Henrietta Breckinridge, the widow of Armistead Breckinridge, is now free. And this is from the state of Kentucky. So for his service, his family gets freedom. So I thought this was really pretty cool. And this is an indication of what I talked about changing sort of the rules for documentation. So here is evidence based on a marriage not able to be documented. And so this is a statement of someone who was at the marriage and said, I attended the marriage at such and such a date, and since both being slaves, and therefore there were no records made of it at the time. And so this then did pass as documentation. So the women could, in fact, get their pensions.
Did the pension laws cover the Confederate widows?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. As a matter, very much later, because as a matter of fact, the story that I heard was like 19-something. They finally decided, okay, we're going to relent. We're going to cover Confederate widows. There was one Confederate widow still alive. So it wasn't a terribly magnanimous sort of, yeah. But anyway, then there are odd finds, okay? These are the stuff you don't find every day, but they're really fun. This is the mole. Somebody actually found this mole, this dead mole, in a pension file. And the story goes thus. Soldier, I guess bored out of his gourd, sitting in his tent, finds a mole, kills him, and sends him off to his wife in a letter that starts, Dear wife, and goes on and on. She supposedly shows this to a bunch of her friends. Somehow the letter gets lost, but she keeps the mole. So later on, when she wants to get a pension, in order to try to show that she was the wife of this guy, she got all of her friends to write affidavits saying, yeah, we saw that letter that said, Dear wife, making the connection, and the mole, and here's the mole. We are sending you in the mole with all of these letters. You can see how the mole has left his mark on this letter, which is not the original letter from the guy, but the letters to the pension office. She got her pension, whether it was because of this questionable, but a good try. So this is another story, and sometimes what's hard is we learn about those stories backwards, because you start out in 1884, and the pension office in Philadelphia is getting a little concerned about a couple of pension agents who seem to be doing way too many transactions. So they look into this, and they find out that these gentlemen are getting money from the pension of Esther Springfield. So why isn't Esther herself getting her pension? So they look a little further. They find Esther's I don't know, it was her neighbor or the woman she roomed with or something, who said, oh yeah, I remember Esther. Well, you know, in 1882, one day she got her pension money, she got drunk, she left, I never saw her again. So they put that fact together with another fact that they deduced from somewhere else, that a few days after that date, there had been a notice in the newspaper that the body of a woman had washed up on the shores of the Delaware River. They went to the place where that particular Jane Doe, they nicely had actually somehow coordinated that article with a particular Jane Doe number blah blah. They exhumed Jane Doe number blah blah. They cut that particular piece of fabric off of her apron. They exhibited it to the lady who was her friend or neighbor who had seen her last in 1882. And she said, oh yeah, that's the fabric, that's her apron, that's Esther, okay. And so Esther was no longer, you know, DOA number 23. She got her real burial, we knew what happened to her, and then the bad guys no longer were getting her pension. But the piece of cloth was key to this story. This is one that I did find, and I thought this was great. You find usually the tintypes are the guys standing in uniform being all nice and what. This guy used this photograph as evidence of his disability. So in addition to those forms that the doctors filled out, here is something else where he is showing the wound in his arm that is making him unable to do his work. And he puts a letter here saying, I can't do any more. If you want me to go get a doctor's information, but here's the proof. And this is I think this is the only time I've ever seen a photograph that is the proof of the disability. Now, we're going to get into my fun stories. These are the things that I found, and I found to be fascinating. This takes place in Lincoln and Casey counties, Kentucky. Barbara, the widow of Peter, is here remarried to a Mr. Falconberry. She has her 2 kids by her first husband. She gets married again. Notice that the gentleman is 25 and she's 30. Okay, they have 2 more children. She's pregnant with a 3rd, and he ups and leaves and never comes back. Nicely enough, you see her Barbara here as mother living with this guy who is Jesse here, living with her son, and he takes care of her for a while. This is fine. Unfortunately, they kind of come on hard times, and in the teens, well, actually no, more around 1910, they decide they really need to get to the pension office and see if they can't get a widow's pension based on the service of Peter Wall. Well, the problem is she can't prove that she's divorced from Mr. Falconberry, nor can she prove that Mr. Falconberry is dead, although she alleges that she has heard that he is dead. In the examinations attempts to figure out what happened to Mr. Falconberry, a lovely story comes out about how when he left her, he went off with a younger woman, no longer keen on the woman 5 years older than he, that woman and that woman's mother murder her husband so they can be together. They are taken up by the authorities. I have one document that I found that's separate from the pension files when I was trying to do other research that indicates that Henry Falconberry was in fact in jail and somebody was paid a little sum for taking care of him in jail. That's the only thing I've really been able to find about it. But for some unknown reason, they all 3 get let out of prison. The wife, or the woman in the case, and her mother go off to Missouri. So they killed the hubby for nothing because she's not hanging with Mr. Falconberry. And Mr. Falconberry goes on to do, so many other things, so many other women, so many women, so little time. And there's this whole sordid story that comes out about what her husband did. But the problem in the end is she still doesn't have proof of death or divorce. In 1912, she says, okay, I'll get divorced. She gets a divorce. She sends the divorce papers in. Guess what? They don't just add the divorce papers to the application she had already sent in. They sent it back and said, okay, you can do this, but you got to send in a whole new application too. And she gets her pension in 1914, and she dies in 1916. So then this was a big family secret. This is also a fun story. We have the case of Emma. Is she or is she not the daughter of John Chase? Now, John Chase had married at one point a woman named Eliza Howland, and there is a birth record in the town of Dennis in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, that says Emma Frances Chase was born to John Chase. Oh, come on. John Chase and Eliza Chase. Now, she's the former Eliza Howland who married Mr. Chase. But notice this lovely little thing down here. This was recorded in 1863 for a birth that took place on December 5th, 1855. Pension examiner got a little hinkied by this whole thing. And then he went and found that there was another record in the same town. Shit, sorry. Emma Frances Howland, not Emma Frances Chase, illegitimate child of Eliza Howland, not Eliza Chase yet. And the birth date is the same. It's December 6, 1855, and it's recorded December 17, 1855. This looks a whole lot more like the real record. Now, Emma says that she didn't know this, that this was a total surprise to her. I'm not sure that's completely true. I come down on both sides of the story for this one. But she rescinds her request for the pension because she now finds out that Mr. Chase, although the husband of her mother, was not her father. Therefore, she has no claim to a pension as his minor. Well, she's not a minor child anymore, but as his minor, you can get retroactive pensions. So then the question is, who is the father of of Emma? Well, unfortunately, it's Elkanah Howland. And Elkanah Howland was the father of the said Eliza, who had carnal knowledge of her. This other document, which is not from the pension file, is from the court records in Barnstable County. He was actually tried and convicted of incest, served 4 years, and the family was never the same, based on what I can see about what happened to them in later censuses and so forth, when that came out. But for some reason, and the timing is a little bit hinky as to whether you could really say that you'd be living in that town and not know that something had gone on because he was in fact tried and convicted. But it could have been just before she went for the pension and stuff. That may have been why this came out. I'm not quite sure. But she at least alleged that she did not know that Mr. Chase was not her father and that her grandfather was also her father. Now, Mary was an enterprising woman. She was widowed as a young woman with, I think, one child in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. She then moved into the big city, into Harrisburg, Dauphin County. Well, you got to do something to make a living, right? So here she is. Mrs. Snoddy was reported for keeping a disorderly body house. Not even just a body house, but a disorderly body house, okay? Then a couple days later in the paper, this is 1887, Mary Snoddy kept a body house on Charles Avenue and will now spend 7 months in jail. She doesn't hide this from the pension office. Here is a pension office document from within her file that says, it appears that you were convicted, you went to jail, you paid a fine of $5, which interestingly enough, when I was looking in some of these other it's like the police blotter for that newspaper at that time. So what I'm saying is she paid $5 fine. There was another little thing that said a black woman who had taken the dress of her mistress was also fined $5, which seems awful high if she's only getting $5 fine for a body house. Something's kinky there. At any rate, Mary doesn't say she didn't do it. She says, of course I did it. Of course I ran a body house. Remember, 1887, this is after 1882, our lovely little Anti-Cohabitation Act. She said, but what's your problem? I didn't do anything. I didn't cohabit with anybody. Just because I ran a body house doesn't mean that I have anything to do with this law. You have no reason to rescind my pension. I am not guilty of cohabitation. It's a good argument, but it didn't fly, and they took away her pension anyway because I guess they really just figured she was immoral enough that whether she really did it herself or not, they weren't liking her as somebody on the pension rolls. So they got rid of poor Mary. Now, this is a nice case in a way. Good old Esther, who was the widow of Henry Patterson, relatively soon after he died, darn it, he died, remarried a Mr. Fred Howell, and this is their tombstone, and this is just a general picture of a courthouse in that area. So, but what happened with Esther was she had made a pledge to her dying mother that she would care for this child, that the relationship with the child, the age, the gender is never stated. But the notion is that she had this obligation. And supposedly when she remarried, which of course made her lose her pension, or supposed to lose her pension, supposedly this new husband's family, at least at first, wasn't at all keen in giving her enough money to take care of this obligation. So she fraudulently kept her pension. She kept it for 14 years. She was very moral, though. The minute the child was out of school and no longer needed her assistance, she stopped taking the pension. Well, unfortunately, the pension office did find out about it, and they weren't too keen on the reasons for this fraud. It was still fraud. She had taken money from the US government she did not deserve. So they were going to take her off to jail. But in this case, there are some lawyers involved, and they're writing a little brief, and I love this thing. We must temper, what's it say? Justice should be tempered with mercy. Well, I still don't think that they were going for the mercy thing. But guess what? This is the good second husband. He ponied up the entire sum that she had fraudulently taken over those 14 years, paid the government, and she did not go to jail. So this was the good second husband rather than the mostly awful second husbands. This is the story of the son or sons of John Price, who was a lumber worker, and that's what this sort of generic photograph is, in the sort of on the Michigan-Ontario border, and kind of went back and forth and back and forth. And this is actually a current day picture of a little law office in Allegan, Michigan, which is where all this took place. So good old James, who was the son of John, after the death of his mother and his father, came to the pension office and got a pension as the son of John. Peachy. Years go by. And all of a sudden, a guy named John Price comes to Allegan, Michigan, and says, "Excuse me, I'm the son of John Price. I want a pension. I need a pension. I'm the son of John Price." And they said, "Well, wait a minute. We've already got a son of John Price. And we think he only has one son. Here we've got the marriage record to the woman. We've got the birth record of the kid. There's only James. Well, who are you?" Well, the second John has pretty good documentation that indicates that back in Canada, John Price, the father, had married another woman, had had John. That woman had died. He had left John with his grandmother back up in Ontario, come stateside, done his thing, remarried, been in the war, you know. Why it took so long for John up in Canada to sort of get the picture, not too sure. But he comes over to get the pension, and you know what? He had good enough documentation. He darn well got his pension as another son of John Price. The unfortunate part of the story is that by the time John did this, James had died, and he never got to meet his half-brother. And this is good old Helen. Helen is a real hard luck story, but boy, she was a trooper. She's widowed at a young age with one child. She lives in the town with her parents, has a pension, things are okay, but getting a little tight, so she takes her son and sets him off with the grandfather. She comes back to town and tries to keep on working. She never seems to have enough money, so she gets in debt. She gets in debt to the tune of $90, which seems ridiculous now, but that's probably pretty much a lot of money at this time. So one day, in fear of of being, looked at badly in the streets and possibly being taken up by the authorities, she kind of scampers out of town. She leaves behind everything. She leaves behind the pension. And for 20 years, she runs around this area of the country as an itinerant teacher of the Deland method of pattern making. I believe that has to do with dressmaking, coats, whatever, but this Deland method. She never made enough money to pay off that debt as well as keep herself living during all this time. This is the list from the front of the particular special examination, which lists all of the depositions that were taken. And they're taken mostly from the people with whom she boarded and with whom she worked during this time around all of these different towns. And everybody said all nice things about her. But she still had done a sort of little naughty things with her pension document that she had left behind. But finally, it's just too bad. And she comes to the pension office, and they start up this examination. Nicely enough for her, they found her son for her. He's now a grown man. She's been doing this for like 20 years. He lives in Buffalo, and he comes to her aid. And I actually don't remember whether she got a pension, but the part of the story that I like is after all that running around, all that heartache, she is reunited with her son. Her son does not hate her for having abandoned him. He takes her in, and she lives her last days out with her son and his wife. So that was the nice end to Helen's story. And that's the end of my stories, but I do hope that you guys go forth and find some of your own. And thank you very much.
If we go to the archives, are we able to get copies of anything that's in the file?
Absolutely. What I do is I scan. I like digitized documents. They've got this great new Xerox machine in the reading room upstairs there that you can copy, you can scan to a disk, or you can scan to a thumb drive from that, whatever. You can take your own scanner, you can use digital photography. The only thing is if you take your own scanner to the National Archives, then you must have a flatbed scanner. You cannot have anything that the paper has to go through, or anything that the kind that you run over the top of a piece of paper. So yes, you can copy. For the most part, they say if it's really falling apart, oh my God, maybe you shouldn't copy it, but they usually just put it in Mylar and copy it. So, yeah.
I found records online of Dr. Mike Adams. He suffered an injury at Gettysburg, resulted in him spending time at some invalid home for veterans in Taugust, Maine.
There was a whole system of those invalid homes, and in some of the other kinds of files where the men especially lasted longer, you can find an awful lot of information about them living in these homes towards the end of their lives. And the thing that's great about those documents is that they put these gorgeous, what do you want to call them? What do we call this stuff at the top of a letter? That's
Logo.
Well, sort of logo,
Or
but the printed stuff.
headers.
right.
Letterhead, see, I can't even talk. Letterhead thingy-jiggies, and they're gorgeous engravings of the actual facility with the names of all the people who were the head, right? But they're beautiful, really. I mean, the whole engraving thing has kind of gone away, but they're really lovely. And some of the letters home from the front, I didn't image any of them in this talk, weren't just plain pieces of paper, and I don't know where they got these things, but they would have, again, some sort of heading that has to be engraved. It was kind of the only method back then. But they were sometimes in color, and they were often, what would you call it, patriotic, like Rah Rah America or the flag. So the first page of their letter had this pretty thing on the top of it, and then usually those were those four-fold letters. They're small format. You have the first page, you open it up, you write another page, and then back on the end. And they have some really lovely engravings on the front side. I don't know where they got the stationery. I mean, they're supposed to be at the front. They're supposed to be in a war. But it's cool stuff.
You said some of the records that weren't, some of them that had an XC number were at the VA?
Right, the XC numbers reference pensions that were active later into the 20th century even. So the types where, you know, the widow was a young woman who married the guy when he was really ancient, and so she's living into God knows what the 30s are. And those have a tendency to not have been relinquished by the Veterans Administration yet. From what I understand is they're going through a process of, I don't know what you call it, decommissioning or whatever, but moving those documents to the archives bit by bit. But
Well, I noticed one of the records that you were showing up there said Department of the Interior Bureau of Pensions.
yes, that's.
So that's initially where
Initially, it was
the-
the Department of Interior, but now they have all gone over to the Veterans Administration. So that's where anything that's not in the National Archives will be at the VA.
Okay.
And if you go down to, well, I suspect they have them here in the research room, but certainly down at A1, they have the forms for you to fill out to at least attempt to do your FOIA request to get it.
I've gotten one. It's
You
been
have?
several years, yeah, but I ordered my great-grandfather's because he remarried and his wife, his second wife, lived into the 1950s.
Yeah.
The one difference is they protect privacy. So all the information about anyone that they thought might still be living was blacked out.
No fun at all.
But they did the same thing for my father's, where they blacked out my brothers and sisters' names and birth dates and everything, but not mine.
So they thought you were dead.
No, well, I mean, I was the one requesting the file, so
Oh,
they
well,
didn't
yeah,
have to
okay,
keep
yeah, yeah, yeah.
information from me.
Right, right.
They couldn't tell me my brother's birthday or anything, like I don't know it.
Yeah, sometimes the privacy thing and certain things is really crazy. And you think, you know, what would I do with that information that was so dastardly? But anyway.
And where, like you made a reference, or there's a listing of the years that these laws were passed.
Uh-huh.
What are some of the citations for those?
That was actually something that I cribbed off of something that's given to us as volunteers. So there's no particular citation for that information. However, my colleague has mentioned that Christine Rose has written a book about the pension laws, and that would be your best source for a real documented series of, you know, how and when they changed.
Okay, thank you.
Because I dummied that up from my handout, actually.
If I may share, I'm working on basically all the pension files from a regiment, which is actually several, so I've been throughout. But the most interesting I found was a widow's pension, and it's actually several pensions. And she was married, her first husband died in the war on duty in 1863. She remarried in 1864, and he died. She had one child by her first husband, two by her second. He died in 1868. She remarried in 1870 and had one more child, and he died in 1882. And she remarried in 1885 and divorced him in 1886. And on the same day she divorced him, she married another soldier.
Yep.
And then he
Yep.
died in 1892. And then in 1893 she married another soldier who was a
That's
widower.
America.
And she died, and he died in 1897. And then in 1898 she married another soldier who died in 1980. But at one point in her form she said, after my first husband died, I didn't marry again except for William husband one, you know, and then she named these 7 other husbands.
That's exactly
And it's like,
what-
except for? What do you mean?
I don't know what that's about, but that happened in another file that we saw where they were trying to say that this lady and this guy were cohabiting and
She got her pension back. I mean,
without
she,
marriage, and they said, well, but we have people in your town who say that you've had children together. Therefore, you know, you've been cohabiting without benefit of marriage. And she said, well, we haven't had any children, but, and she named 6.
yeah.
Go figure, you know.
This is, I call her the Black Widow. I don't know what it is.
I mean, now, I've seen serial marriages, but nothing quite like that one.
And they all died except for the one in the middle who was a divorce. And 4 of them were soldiers, so.
Well, I'd like to
And
know
all
how
the
these
files
women
in the
found all
cabinet
these guys
were-
to marry them. I mean, if I got rid of my hubby, I don't really think it'd be all that easy to go find another one.
Well,
These
and she
ladies
lived
had
in the
no
same
trouble.
area the whole time. Almost all the marriages are in the same county. So she never moved.
Interesting,
He's got a
because
reputation.
I should hope so by then. Because some of these people also did do an awful lot of moving on, and there are some stories about guys who lit out one night who never came back, and it was the old thing that we probably can't really do so much anymore with tracking and whatever, but you'd go west and you'd be somebody else and you'd never be found again. And that was a way to restart lives a lot of times. And there's one file that I have where then they finally found the guy and he wasn't the guy who was killed in this knife fight in OK Corral, he was over here, and whether he did or didn't want to get back in touch with the kid. So, I mean, you get everything in these files. I mean, it's real life, it's people, it's all the gamut of human emotions, human relationships. Not that different from us today, in a sense. Certain parts of their world were different, but they were humans, they were people.
Did the pension office do research on people to find, I mean, did they have inspectors who went out to check it out?
Exactly. As a matter of fact, they had people who had like beats, and you might get an assignment to do a thing in your region. And you would go around and do X. And then they would write back to the guys and say, okay, here's this affidavit, this one. I think we're done here, or I think it's actually worth following with sending inspector number blah, blah over there to go and depose a few other dudes here. And so then you get sometimes a variety of, well, if you go to Helen's list there, so that's a list of one examination, one special examination, and all the affidavits that go with that. That doesn't mean there's only one examination per file, because it could be a different gentleman in a different location deposing a couple of people for something that's related. So they must have had an army of these people. Yeah. Really, it's amazing. The total employment, you know.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but for those of you who have to, if you have to leave, that's fine. If not, you can feel free to stay, questions, answers. But I need your evaluations here, and I'll be back to get those, okay? Thank you very much. Excuse me.
Sure, no problem. So, it's just a can of worms, but a good can.
Would you know whether the pension applications for the veterans are any closer to being digitized than the widows' ones?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Less likely.
Okay.
There's a zillion more of them than there are the widow's pensions. The widow's pensions is a project that's going to take a very long time. I don't know when, if, and how they're going to do the envelope.
This is the man I was mentioning,
Oh, thank
Timothy
you.
Matlack. I think he might have been a colonel in the Revolutionary Army. If you look on Wikipedia, they have a lot of information about him. His portrait is in the National